My name is David Miller. I am 72 years old. For 28 years, I worked as a senior image restoration specialist at the National Reconnaissance Office in Virginia. Our department was responsible for digitizing and cleaning old spy satellite films from the Cold War era, specifically the KH-9 hexagon mission logs from the mid-1970s. These were massive rolls of physical film dropped from space in capsules and recovered mid-air by military aircraft. Officially, we were restoring these images to map historical borders and check old Soviet military infrastructure. But in the winter of 2023, our team received a corrupted container marked Classified Exhibit Delta. The canister had no digital barcode, no standard federal serial numbers, just a handwritten date November 12, 1974. I loaded the first roll of film into the high-resolution drum scanner to begin the digital transition. The first few hundred frames were completely normal. High-altitude black and white shots of the Siberian tundra, frozen lakes, military warehouses. But then the frames started to glitch out, not because of water damage or chemical aging of the film. The silver halide crystals on the negative were warped, forming strange crystalline geometric pattern. I adjusted the digital filters to clean the distortion, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The image was taken over the Arctic Circle during a clear winter night. The spy camera wasn't focused on the ground below. The satellite had suffered a severe stabilization error, and its lens was tilted upward toward the deep space void. The photo captured the edge of the Earth's atmosphere and the open stars behind it, but the stars weren't arranged in their natural constellations. A massive wall of dark organic textures was weaving between the star clusters. It looked like giant veins or thick black roots stretching across light years of empty space, connecting the stars together like a colossal cosmic spiderweb pulsing with internal energy. I checked the telemetry data etched onto the side of the film strip. The satellite's sensor had recorded an immediate drop in light levels during that exact orbit. The space around Earth wasn't empty darkness anymore. Something massive was enclosing the planet row by row, layer by layer. It had no heat signature, no radiation output. A silent shadow miles wide creeping through the vacuum. Then the main server terminal in my lab clicked, and a security warning flashed on the screen. It wasn't an automatic system alert. My access permissions for Exhibit Delta were being revoked in real time by an external administrator. A voice came through my encrypted desktop intercom, layered and distorted by a heavy digital buzz. The voice said, "Unit 4, please step away from the terminal immediately. The alignment of 1974 is not a processing error. Disconnect the scanner or your clearance will be permanently terminated." I looked back at the glowing monitor screen before it went black, and for the first time in my career, I realized that the Cold War wasn't about weapons or borders. We weren't looking at our enemies on Earth. Both superpowers were looking up at the sky, realized that the cage was closing around us. The monitor screen went completely dark and dead. The silence inside the small basement archive room felt heavy and cold. I stood there staring at my own reflection in the black glass of the terminal. My hands were shaking against the edge of the metal desk. I could hear the steady electronic hum of the server racks behind the partition wall. Suddenly, the high-resolution drum scanner began to spin again on its own. It wasn't scanning the film, it was moving backward with a loud mechanical grinding noise. The physical film from 1974 was being drawn back into the scanner core. I reached for the manual override switch to cut the power supply to the machine. But the moment my fingers touched the iron toggle, a sharp electric shock threw me backward. Every light bulb in the basement corridor began to flicker and buzz violently. The air inside the room grew uncomfortably warm within seconds, smelling of burnt silver and static. I looked down at the portable data recorder that was linked to the main scanner unit. The auxiliary screen was flashing with a red memory overflow warning, data packet. The data wasn't being downloaded from our internal agency network. The scanner was processing a signal that was embedded inside the silver crystals of the negative film itself. A raw acoustic frequency that had been stored on that physical film roll for 50 years. The speaker of the data recorder burst into life, emitting a clear, rhythmic sound. It didn't sound like static, it didn't sound like white noise. It sounded like a massive heavy iron bell swinging in a vacuum miles above our heads, slow and deliberate, vibrating the glass panels of the light fixtures overhead. I grabbed my jacket and walked toward the heavy security exit door to find help. But as I reached the door, a digital card reader, Reader 9, clicked by itself. The small indicator light turned from steady green to blinking dark red. The central mainframe had locked down Sector 9, entirely cutting off all ventilation. I looked back at the drum scanner terminal and nearly collapsed onto the concrete floor. The digital preview screen had turned back on displaying a live feed of the scanning bed. The film negative was no longer displaying the black and white Siberian landscape. The silver grains on the film were actively moving, rearranging themselves like a swarm of dark ants. They were forming a text string right in front of my eyes in a clean digital font. The text read, "The cage is compliant. Do not record the outline." Then the intercom on the wall buzzed again with a loud distortion spike. It wasn't the administrator's voice this time. It was the voice of my old supervisor Miller, who had disappeared in 1998. His voice sounded flat, layered, and cold coming through the tiny speaker grid. The voice said, "David, you must not finish the digitization process. The satellites didn't take photos of space, they were recording the membrane of the Predator. We aren't looking at stars, David, we are looking at the eyes." The voice of my old supervisor died out into a low-frequency hum. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady, mechanical clanging from the recorder. I backed away from the intercom toward the center of the dark archive room. The lines of green matrix code on the main terminal were scrolling at an impossible speed. The temperature inside Sector 9 dropped instantly from boiling heat to freezing cold. My breath turned into thick, white vapor in front of my face. I looked through the glass partition toward the secondary digitization bay. The heavy automatic film developer machines were activating one by one without human commands. The chemical tanks inside were bubbling, releasing a strong acidic smell of sulfur and ammonia. The liquid negatives inside the glass tubes weren't turning transparent. They were turning into a thick, reflective gold fluid that began to pulse with a dark light. I checked the diagnostic monitors for our orbital tracking array. The National Reconnaissance Office had 12 active spy satellites over the northern hemisphere. Every single one of them was reporting a critical attitude control failure. Their reaction wheels were spinning out of control, tilting their optics upward at 90 degrees, exactly like the rogue satellite in 1974. a perfect, flawless sphere of dark matter enclosing the Earth like a shell. I noticed that the starlight wasn't being blocked out completely. It was being bent and refracted around the dark roots, forming massive luminous patterns, like a giant digital display screen losing its resolution grid. The space around us was shrinking. The vacuum was compressing. The boundaries of reality were failing. Then the main steel security door of the sector began to vibrate violently. Someone was hitting the reinforced iron from the outside with heavy rhythmic impacts. Not a human fist, not a battering ram. It sounded like a massive iron piston striking the metal plating. The thick steel was beginning to warp and bend inward, forming a deep vertical crease. The lines of gold code on my terminal changed into a single message. The environment has encountered an unregistered observer. Begin purge of Sector 9. I scrambled beneath a heavy iron desk, pulling the portable data recorder with me. The overhead fluorescent lights exploded one by one, showering the concrete floor with glass shards, leaving the room in absolute darkness, save for the glowing gold screens and the pulsing fluid in the developer tubes. And that's when I heard the footsteps inside the room, not from the door, from the ceiling directly above my head. The footsteps above me didn't sound like boots on concrete. It was a dry, clicking sound like heavy bone or hard resin hitting the ceiling panels. The ceiling tiles were bending downward under an impossible weight from above. I pressed my back against the iron desk, holding the portable data recorder to my chest. The metallic clanging from the speaker had slowed down, matching the pace of the clicking above. Each impact was vibrating the air inside my lungs, making it hard to breathe. A single ceiling panel snapped with a loud crack, dropping dust and debris onto the floor. Through the gap, a long, thin limb descended into the dim gold light of the room. The limb wasn't organic, and it wasn't mechanical. It was made of a smooth, dark matte material that completely absorbed the glow of the monitors. It had too many joints bending in directions that made my stomach turn with a wave of nausea. The tip of the limb was a sharp needle-like digit that began to trace symbols in the air. Every symbol it drew left a permanent line of static interference hanging in the darkness. The intercom on the wall exploded with a sharp, high-pitched squeal that made my ears bleed. A voice came through the distortion, layered with hundreds of overlapping monotone frequencies. The voice said, "Subject 4 has documented the membrane. The observation unit must now be integrated into the outer boundary." I looked at the main projection screen on the wall before the wires melted completely. The active satellite feeds were showing that the black veins in the sky were descending. They weren't staying in deep space anymore. The dark roots were dipping into the upper atmosphere over the Arctic Circle. The friction against the air was turning them a deep, glowing violet color. A giant burning net closing around the globe, row by row, layer by layer. The global positioning networks died completely across the entire Western Hemisphere. Not because these satellites were broken. The space between the satellites and the ground stations was being physically compressed. The dimensions of the sky were shrinking, reducing the distance between Earth and the dark void. The heavy iron desk I was hiding beneath began to slide across the floorboards on its own. The gravity inside Sector 9 was failing, shifting toward the opening in the ceiling. I grabbed the metal leg of the server rack, trying to stop myself from floating upward. The tall, gaunt figure finally dropped from the ceiling panels, landing soundlessly in the center of the room. It had no face, just a smooth, polished, dark visor built directly into its elongated skull. And inside the visor, I could see the reflection of the spy satellite photo from 1974. But the reflection was moving, showing the black veins tightening their grip around my own house. The figure raised its long arm and pointed its needle digit directly at my forehead. And inside my skull, a single command resonated with deafening clarity. Do not attempt to resist the coupling. The needle digit didn't cut my skin. The moment it hovered an inch from my forehead, the room around me dissolved. I was no longer inside the dark basement of Sector 9. I was floating in a cold gray vacuum, looking down at a massive circular room, a secret underground command bunker built beneath the ice of Greenland. The calendar on the concrete wall read November 14th, 1974. Around a massive mahogany table sat 12 men in high-ranking military uniforms. 6 of them were American generals from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The other 6 were Soviet marshals from the Kremlin defense sector. It was the height of the Cold War, but they weren't fighting each other. They were looking at a shared projection screen displaying the early satellite films. General Vance stood up, his hands trembling as he pointed at the black roots in the sky. He said the membrane had reached the upper layers of our exosphere. The Soviet marshal answered his voice flat and robotic through an electronic translator. He said our nuclear tests in the atmosphere weren't weapons development projects. Both nations were firing high-yield warheads into the upper sky, trying to burn the roots, trying to tear a hole in the organic cage before it finished its construction cycle. But the weapons had failed completely. The kinetic energy of the nuclear explosions was only feeding the black material, making the veins grow thicker and more aggressive with every strike. Then a document was placed on the table signed by both the U.S. President and the Soviet Premier. It was called the Magnetosphere Preservation Accord, a secret treaty to turn off every high-frequency radar station on the planet, to stop looking at the sky entirely, to erase all evidence from the public archives. The leaders realized that the entity in the deep space void was reactive. It didn't grow by itself, it was drawn toward observation and awareness. The more human eyes focused on the outline of the predator, the faster it closed its grip. Our cameras, our telescopes, our scanners were the very triggers for the tightening cycle. The general in the Greenland bunker looked straight up toward the concrete ceiling. He whispered that we had 60 years before the membrane reached the cloud layer. 60 years to keep humanity completely blind and unaware in the dark. The scene inside the Greenland bunker began to glitch and tear apart into gray lines. The voice of my missing supervisor, Miller, returned inside my head with a sharp static roar. He said, "David, they didn't classify the photos to protect a military secret. They classified them because your eyes are the fuel for the perimeter. And now you have digitized the negative David. The entity knows that the sector has remembered the cage." The white gold light of the projection monitors exploded backward, swallowing my vision, and I fell back into the cold concrete floor of the server room, coughing up black-silver fluid. I dragged myself across the broken glass on the concrete floor. The black-silver fluid from my mouth was cold like liquid ice. The tall, gaunt figure was gone from the center of the room, but the ceiling panels were completely missing, now revealing a hollow, dark shaft. The clanging sound from the data recorder speaker had changed into a low hum, a continuous vibrating tone that sounded like a giant electrical transformer failing. I pulled my body up using the metal edge of the server frame. The diagnostic monitors for the spy satellites were still active on the side console. The telemetry data showed that the orbit of our 12 satellites was decreasing rapidly. They weren't falling because of gravity or the space between the upper orbit and the Earth's surface was actively folding inward. The distance was shrinking by hundreds of miles every few seconds. I staggered toward the secondary terminal to access the global defense grid. A live satellite feed from the weather station over North America opened on the screen. The cloud layers over Canada and the United States were no longer white or gray. They were turning into a dense reflective gold material that looked like polished brass. The gold clouds were pulsing in perfect synchronization with the low transformer hum, like a giant digital projection screen losing its calibration lines in real time. I looked through the heavy iron door frame toward the elevator shaft corridor. The reinforced steel walls of the building were shifting, moving closer to each other. The architecture was compressing, the dimensions of the rooms were changing. The agency mainframe in Virginia was being crushed by the folding space around it. The voice of the administrator came back through the broken intercom speaker on the wall. It didn't sound angry, it didn't sound panicked. It was completely hollow and monotone, the voice said. Sector 9 has failed to comply with the blind protocol. The observation data has leaked into the secondary relays. The outer membrane is now adjusting the boundary limits to 0. I realized what that meant. The entire planet was about to be compressed into a single point. The Treaty of 1974 was a desperate attempt to freeze the geometry of the cage by forcing humanity to look down at the ground, to forget the stars entirely. We built our modern cities, our internet, our entire lives inside a temporary bubble of space. And my scanner had just popped the bubble by recording the outline of the predator. The floor beneath my boots tilted violently, throwing me against the terminal panel. The projection screen on the wall flickered, displaying a final message from the satellite. The membrane has touched the reaction wheels. All optical sensors are now terminated. Outside the facility, the sky over Virginia was turning a solid, blinding gold color. The gold light from the window blinds was too bright to look at directly. It wasn't the warm light of a summer sun. It was a cold, metallic glare that made the shadows inside the room look deep and sharp. I crawled toward the main core server bank at the end of the long, dark hallway. The steel walls of the corridor were now only 3 feet apart. The ceiling was lowering row by row of tiles, forcing me to bend my knees completely. The building was shrinking like a cardboard box being crushed by a giant fist. I reached the security vault of the primary mainframe unit. The double titanium doors were wide open because the hydraulic locks had melted under the power surge. The interior of the vault looked like a digital processing room from a science fiction movie. Thousands of optical data cables were pulsing with a bright gold light transferring data. The anonymous data servers were screaming with a high-pitched mechanical whine. I found the main systems terminal in the center of the raised metal platform. The screen was flashing with a critical warning message from the Pentagon Command Center. The Pentagon has breached the environment. All primary logistics are terminated. The man who had built this archive system was sitting in the operator's chair. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, the director of the National Reconnaissance Office Image Analysis Branch. He didn't move. As I approached his chair, he didn't look at me. His hands were glued to the control panel, His fingers fused into the plastic keys, and his face was completely covered by a layer of smooth, dark, matte skin with no features. He had accepted the coupling, entirely becoming a physical node for the network. He spoke to me through the speakers of the server cabinets around us. His voice was layered with the sounds of static interference and the mechanical clanging of the iron bell. The voice said, "Nicholas, you are too late to delete the film negative. The 60-year lease from 1974 has expired. The information has already been compiled into the outer boundary layer. The space you are standing in is no longer a physical room in Virginia. It is a compressed data packet waiting to be stored in the cosmic sphere." I looked through the panoramic monitoring array on the wall. The satellite view of the Earth was horrifying. The planet looked like a cracked glass marble surrounded by a thick gold net of veins. The continents were splitting apart as the physical space between them was being deleted. New York and London were now only 50 miles apart, according to the radar tracking grids. The vacuum of deep space was pulling the Earth's crust outward from the inside. We weren't the dominant civilization on a permanent planet. We were just the test data running inside a temporary spatial loop, and the program was reaching its final line of execution. D.R. Thorne's featureless dark face didn't move in the operator's chair. The high-pitched whine from the server cabinets grew louder, shaking my teeth. The titanium walls of the vault were closing and pressing against my shoulders. I knew I couldn't delete the film negative through normal software commands. The system had locked all delete permissions under the administrator code, but I remembered the emergency protocol we built for the Cold War, the thermite purge system, a mechanical safety measure designed to physically incinerate the data drives. I dropped to my knees, crawling underneath the main operator platform. The floor beneath me was hot to the touch, smelling of ozone and melting copper. I found the heavy iron junction box hidden behind the primary power transformer. The lever was sealed inside a bright red metal casing marked emergency destruct. The casing was hot enough to blister my skin as I grabbed the handle. I pulled with all my strength, using my weight against the rusted hinge. The iron latch snapped open with a loud mechanical echo through the vault. A digital countdown timer snapped to life on the small liquid crystal display. It read exactly 45 seconds before the thermite charge ignited. The man with the featureless face turned his head toward the lower platform. He didn't have eyes, but the dark visor skin was pulsing with a gold light. The speakers around the room emitted a loud, rhythmic clicking sound. The voice of hundreds of converted agency workers whispered through the static. They said, "David, your memory inversion is an invalid command. The outer membrane has already mapped your neural network during the scan. You cannot burn the data because you are the data drive, David." I looked down at my own hands resting on the iron junction box. My skin was no longer pale or gray under the bright gold light. My fingers were becoming semi-translucent, showing faint gold veins underneath. The silver halide crystals from the old negative film were inside my blood. The high-resolution scanner hadn't just digitized the image on the screen. It had projected the code directly into my central nervous system during the shock. I was carrying the blueprint of the cage inside my own brain cells. The countdown timer reached 15 seconds remaining on the screen. The room around me began to flicker like a movie reel breaking inside a projector. The steel walls of the vault dissolved for 1 second, revealing the deep void outside. an endless dark space filled with millions of suspended metallic spheres, and the burning violet roots were tightening their knots around each one of them. The countdown timer reached exactly 5 seconds remaining. The high-pitched whine from the server racks turned into a deafening roar. The space inside the titanium vault was now so small I couldn't stand up. I lay flat on the hot concrete floor, my chest pressed against the red casing. The gold fluid inside my veins was boiling, creating a sharp pain in my head. The man in the operator's chair dropped forward onto the control panel. His dark, featureless face began to melt, turning into a thick, black liquid oil. The liquid ran down across the keyboard, shorting out the remaining circuits. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. The thermite charges inside the server cabinets ignited with a sudden white flash. No explosion, no blast radius, just an intense, blinding heat of 3,000 degrees. The optical data cables melted instantly, turning into glowing rivers of glass. The digital monitors, the server racks, the metal platform, everything began to liquefy. The screen displaying the live satellite feed from space warped and dissolved. But the gold light didn't leave my eyes as the physical building burned away. The memory of the spy satellite photo remained perfectly clear inside my brain. I realized the thermite couldn't destroy the data because the code was already compiled. The physical hardware in Virginia was just a temporary antenna for the signal. The true terminal was my own consciousness running the sequence in real time. The voice of my old supervisor Miller returned through the burning white noise. His voice was no longer flat, it sounded desperate and distorted by the heat. He said, "David, you must close your eyes to freeze the tracking loop. If you stop looking at the outline, the membrane will lose the connection vectors. The entity cannot compress a sector that refuses to observe the perimeter." I forced my eyes shut, trying to erase the image of the black veins from my memory. I focused on the memory of my first day at the agency before I saw Exhibit Delta. The smell of old paper, the sound of the ocean wind outside the archive building. The gold light in my vision began to split into giant gray blocks of pixels. The rhythmic mechanical clanging of the iron bell faded into a distant echo. The space around me expanded with a sudden sharp pop, like a vacuum seal breaking, and I fell down into a deep, silent darkness that felt completely empty of data. I woke up on a bench inside a quiet train station platform. The air smelled of damp stone, old metal, and cold morning rain. There were no computer monitors, no titanium vault walls, no rivers of melted glass. The sky above the train platform was covered by a thick layer of gray winter clouds. The morning sun was trying to break through the overcast, casting a soft, normal light onto the tracks. I sat up trembling, checking my hands, my arms, my chest. The semi-translucent texture was gone. My skin looked completely human and old. The digital watch on my wrist was ticking steadily, showing exactly 7:15 a.m. The world around me felt permanent, safe, predictable, and solid. I walked out of the station building onto the quiet streets of Alexandria, Virginia. The cars were driving at normal speeds. People were walking to work holding coffee cups. Nobody was running, nobody was screaming, nobody was looking at the sky. I took a deep breath, believing that the thermite code had saved the sector. Believing that, by closing my eyes, I had broken the tracking vectors for the membrane. I returned to my small suburban house at the edge of the town. The television was broadcasting a routine morning news show about local traffic. Everything was perfectly normal until I walked into my study room to sit at my desk. On the wooden surface lay a small manila envelope with no postage stamps, no digital barcodes. Inside was a single physical black and white photograph printed on glossy archival paper. It was a clean digital restoration of the spy satellite negative from Exhibit Delta. But the image wasn't displaying the Arctic Circle or the Siberian tundra anymore. The photograph captured my own house from a high-altitude orbital perspective, and weaving between the trees of my backyard were the thick, dark organic veins. The roots were wrapped around the roof of my bedroom, forming a tight, flawless geometric knot. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back to look up at the morning sky. The gray clouds were shifting, moving slowly in a perfect circular motion directly above my house. And for one brief second, before the mist covered it again, I saw the edge of the sky ripple with a sharp metallic gold glare. The speaker of the old shortwave radio on my bookshelf clicked and buzzed on its own. No static came out, just that quiet, rhythmic, mechanical clicking sound I heard in the vault, like thousands of metal needles hitting a concrete floor. And inside my skull, a collective whisper of thousands of monotone voices echoed one final time. The voice said, "The observation loop has been successfully restored, David. Thank you for verifying the coordinates of the target sector. The ceiling has reached your window. Now welcome the team inside."